identified the three phases of governance. There are just some criteria we think would inform a lot of it. One, the autonomy of SARS. Two, the independence of SARS. Three, taxpayer secrecy. Four, administrative efficiency. So, Judge, if you don't mind, if we can start with the appointment phase. How should the Commissioner of SARS be appointed? We've read your report. The evidence leader this morning read a lot of the evidence we've had from previous Minister and Commissioner Pravin Gordhan. Then we had Minister Nene, and the question is your views on how the appointment of the SARS Commissioner. We would be grateful to hear.
Okay, I think, can I just, your point is absolutely right, that what one's grappling with is just a conceptual problem, which is, if you could call it, a semi-autonomous body. I should just say, and I'm happy to give you the document, the OECD did a report about 9 years ago in 43 countries. It's extremely helpful, because what they try to do is to try to distill fundamental principles of governance to address the questions that you're talking about. And the reason why I got to go back is because SARS is not it's difficult to conceive of it as a completely independent body from the Treasury or the Minister. And I say that because if the Minister actually has to get up and present a budget, and we've seen that happen for the last few years, and then finds himself or herself, as the case may be, in a situation where there's a significant shortfall, not through the Minister's fault, but because of the incompetence of the institution, just take that as a hypothetical for the moment, well then, what is the Minister supposed to do? You can't uncouple the two. So the thing that we were grappling with, Professor Katz, was how do you actually develop some level of autonomy for SARS, which flows directly from the work that you and I did in the Katz Commission, on the one hand, and an appointment procedure which allows a level of autonomy, but not such a level of autonomy that the Minister or the Treasury, or anybody else for that matter, can't do very much about it. And our argument, I think, was this, that the one thing we know is that the present system is hopeless. But that's a strange system, because it wasn't the system of 1997. In 97, as you know, following the Katz Commission's recommendations, it was the Minister who was to appoint. And weirdly, I don't know if you've noticed this, that actually that's still partly the case, not in terms of appointment, but in terms of accountability in relation to customs and excise. Nobody bothered to change that act. So when the SARS Act was changed in 2002-2003 to give the President the power to appoint, and therefore effectively that the President was the person who presided over the SARS Commissioner, and the Minister was powerless to do anything else, that was not true for customs and excise, where the old provision still applied, which was that the Commissioner reports to the Commissioner and is accountable to the Commissioner appoints the Minister, reports to the Minister and is accountable to the Minister. So oddly enough, the Ministers of Finance could have done a hell of a lot, in my view, legally, in relation to Mr. Mayani when it came to the customs side, which, as we know, had huge sorts of problems. So we've got the system at the legislation at the moment is completely at war with itself. The point we put up two proposals, Professor Katz. The one was a parliamentary process, which would be similar to the public protector, that people could apply for the job of the Commissioner of Inland Revenue. They would then be subjected to a committee of Parliament with proper public hearings. Names would then be provided perhaps you don't have to have one name, you could do the same as the Judicial Service Commission does in the Concourt, where you have to provide the President with 3 or 4 names and the President picks one. That's one possibility. Now, of course, when we put up that recommendation, a whole lot of people said to us, but it doesn't really work. And let me not get involved in the intricacies of the public protector, but the fact is a lot of people said, see, it didn't work there. So none of these systems are completely flawless, but that's one approach. The other approach would be, of course, for the minister to make a recommendation which would then have to be approved by Parliament, which is a sort of American confirmation hearings. Both of those have this advantage, that at least you'd have the public know whether the commissioner knew anything about tax and was a competent person. The way it worked with the Mr. Moyani, as I understand it, was about 127 people. Right? My understanding was that there were a whole host of highly qualified people who were totally discarded, and out of the gloamin came Mr. Moyani. And the real question you have to ask in a case like that is, well, what due diligence was done, including did he know anything about tax? Would he have been able to know the difference between gross income and taxable income? And these aren't facetious remarks. These are really very important remarks. So we know that the procedure there was utterly hopeless. So the one advantage of the parliamentary process would at least be that daylight is and publicity is the best disinfectant, and one could go that route. That's one way. The other route, following from Judge Nugent-Tre's comment, is the possibility of having a board.
Sorry, but what is the defect of the first one?
There's no basic defect of the well, let me go back. None of these are perfect because they go to the heart of something fundamental. And since I've said this in other contexts, let me say this now. We know that Parliament failed as a mechanism of accountability over the past decade. It's got nothing to do with tax, that's a reality. We know that because all sorts of things were allowed to happen without proper parliamentary scrutiny. So you're always working with an assumption, Professor Katz, that the parliamentary process is actually going to work as the constitutional designers had in mind. But assuming that it does work in that way, then it's a relatively decent way, it seems to me, of doing it. And at least but I would go further, if I may. I don't only think it's the commission that should be appointed that way. I think we should have 2 or 3 deputy commissioners appointed in exactly the same way. And if you permit me, I'll tell you why I say so. Because if you take the present situation, if there were 2 or 3 deputy commissioners appointed independently of the commissioner, who essentially had total independence of their own, the possibility that they may have spoken out or been a deterrence on what you have clearly heard in so much of your evidence, and indeed what I heard throughout our tenure, would probably be less the case. Because if I want to make the point, the biggest problem that one had here was a culture of fear. Everything that you've heard was known. I certainly knew almost. People from SARS were telling me this all the time, but they wouldn't tell me publicly because of the culture of fear. So the question is, can you construct a situation where it's not just dependent on one person, but you spread the authority out to have deputy commissioners who equally are independent of a commissioner who's bent on a particular form of conduct?
Judge, the deputies would become relevant after the appointment process.
Well,
that
yes,
would be in
but you could recommend,
phase.
yes.
And you want them to be appointed in the same way
I would.
As the...
I would recommend that. One way or the other, I would want that. And by the way, that is true of other tax authorities around the world, which have deputy commissioners. And in fact, if you look at the sort of Australians and the Canadians and the English, there's a team that runs this show. And people feel a sense of independence. They feel they can't simply be leaned upon or put upon by one person in circumstances whereby that person is not doing what they should be doing. So
When
yeah.
we come to, having been appointed, when we come to phase 2, how it will operate,
Yeah.
what the distribution of power is between the commissioner and the 3 deputies.
Well, can I just say this? Just the other alternative proposal was, in a sense, to have some board which could be
May I just stop you, and if I'm allowed to intervene in this debate.
Fabulous.
When you have your three deputies there, who has the power? Can the commissioner, does he have the final say?
I think he'd probably, Chair, I think he'd obviously have to have a final say, but the way it works in other countries is these deputies are designated to do certain tasks. They run, let's say, the computer system, the assessment system, etc. So the power is diffused. I mean, the fact is, if you really want to know what was going on in SARS at this particular point in time, my impression was that the Commissioner actually was not hands-on in the slightest. Every time I met him, I had Mr. Makwakwa was the person who came to tell me, right, what I wanted to know, to the extent that I was going to get any information at all. But I didn't get it from the Commissioner. So what I'm trying to say is, I think that you wouldn't want one person to, and I don't think it's possible.
Sorry, just finish the sentence. You wouldn't want one person
to run the whole, if you've got this sort of, pyramid structure, you're asking for trouble, and I don't think it's possible in a sophisticated revenue authority, meaning the way it works in these other countries is that the work is apportioned between the commissioner and the deputy, and there's an executive management team that runs the show with particularly designated roles to deputies.
But deputies is the alternative to the board.
No, well, deputies are irrespective. I'd have deputies.
Whether or not you have a board.
Well, I think there should be deputy commissioners of inland revenue who do certain. Look, prior to one of the issues that I understand, and you've probably heard evidence to this effect, that allowed for a change in the model was the allegation, and I won't put it further than that there was one person, Mr. Hoare, who really had huge power in the organisation, and the idea was that wasn't healthy, and so suddenly you wanted to diffuse power. So and that point's not an incorrect proposition. It's this question of what they did with that problem as opposed to what they should have done. So what I'm trying to say, Professor Katz, is that if the Australians and the Canadians and the Americans and the English have an executive team of commissioners and deputy commissioners with designated roles and a level of independent tenure, I think that's much more helpful.
Can I just add a dimension here?
Yeah.
There are two functions that a commissioner has. One of the tax functions.
Yeah.
Tax, forget about policy, but taxpayer exercising discretions in tax matters and administrative, non-tax.
Yeah.
I think what we were veering to is in the administrative functions, a board could suffice. That board would have nothing to do with tax functions. What I'm hearing you say, the deputy commissioners would be involved with the commissioner in tax functions. So you could have deputy commissioners to assist on the tax functions, and the board's involvement is on administrative
Well,
functions.
take a simple proposition. If you want, as I understand, and quite rightly so, that because I understand Mr. Kingan quite rightly has brought this back, the large corporate centre, which was a disaster when it was taken away. Why would you not have somebody with the authority of a deputy commissioner running that? It's a critical function. You don't need the commission to do that. And you want somebody who's confident enough, they've got tenure, they can run the show without fear or favour, and they're accountable to the commissioner, but the fact is that they've got some operational autonomy of their own. I mean, this is a massive organisation. No private company of such size would simply defer everything to one person.
Is that more semantic, or otherwise? That means
No, I'm talking about.
can have a head of large business centre who's
Yes.
not a deputy commissioner.
I agree. I'm just giving you an illustration. What I'm trying to suggest is that by diffusing power and by having a management committee, like they have in other countries, chosen in the same fashion, you give people a level of independence, and you want as much as possible to create a culture of independence so that you can never get back to the same situation that we're in, what we got ourselves into, where one person, in the most extraordinary fashion, created a culture of such fear that everybody else knew they were wrong and they weren't going to do anything about it.
But one thing I would suggest, if with the judge's permission, and to stop this being a Punch and Judy show,
As long as I'm not Judy.
Yeah. I didn't have that in mind. I think with respect, one thing we need to be careful about is in constructing a new governance model, we should look at best practice in that and not be overly concerned at overcoming what was probably unique in what happened here.
But it is, yes, but I think, sorry to interrupt you, but I think that is best practice.
No, but
because,
I'm saying,
yeah.
Some of the things we've heard that happened here were perhaps unique. We mustn't be, I'm suggesting to the judge and the panel and Carol, that we should have a structure that is right and not overly concerned about preventing a total recurrence of what appeared to have happened here. That's the only point I make.
I accept that, but if, for example, best practice allows for a level of accountability and independence and integrity in an institution, so much the better. All I'm saying is that when you go through, and as I've done, discuss this with revenue authorities around the world, it does appear to me that what works best is an executive committee of people properly appointed, and I think that I think that deputy commissioners should be properly appointed with the commissioner. That having been said,
sorry, is that for tax functions?
yeah,
and
tax functions.
administrative functions?
Yes, I suppose so. I haven't thought about the second part, but I suspect the answer is yes. That doesn't mean ultimate responsibility doesn't rely with the commissioner. Your alternative to the parliamentary process would be to have a board chaired probably by an independent person. When I suggested that perhaps it should be a retired judge, people said, "Are you looking for a job?" But the answer is that's not what I had in mind. But it did seem to me, I know we tried with Judge Corbett at one point, and I'm not entirely certain why that all failed, but it did. I accept that. And you probably might have found that out better than I. But the fact is that the notion of having a board with an independent chair who has absolutely no clients to speak of and is totally out of the process but has the knowledge, and then having a series of independent, if you could, almost non-executive types on a board, it seems to me, and there are all sorts of different mechanisms for best practice for that. Certain countries now have, for example, Australian Inspector of Taxation, who actually is a body that looks at the revenue. It's a separate body, not an ombudsman, but actually looks at performance. You could have a board. That board, if properly constituted, could itself make suggestions, give a list from which the minister would have to choose a SARS commissioner and deputy commissioners. That's another alternative.
So the board would have two functions.
Yes.
One, the ongoing oversight function, and two, the involvement in the appointment of the commission.
Well, what it would do would be that, because it would be an expert independent body, assuming that you've got 100 people applying for the SARS commissioner's job, they would then make a short list of, say, 6 or 7. They could do the interviews themselves. Here are people who really know what they're talking about. You take it out of the political domain into a technical domain, and you say to the minister, here are 6 choices, and he then makes his decision accordingly.
Well, it begs the question, who appoints the board?
No, I accept that. I think that board would have to be appointed probably by government, but then on the other hand, we've got certain levels of precedent for that, and we could look towards the South African Reserve Bank's board structure, the non-executive directors, how they're appointed, and have a similar structure there. It is a possible model that we can adopt. We put this up, Judge Nugent, as just 2 separate attempts to think through the problems. We're not saying they're perfect, but both of them are a hell of a lot better than what we've got at the moment.
And who's the board accountable to?
Well, the board would essentially advise the minister as such, and would ultimately be accountable to the minister to the extent that, well, once you've decided who appoints them, they'd have to be accountable to to that body, but the board would ultimately work with the minister and advise the minister. It's a much more sophisticated model, I suppose, of the Tax Advisory Committee, which you chaired and of which I was on for a number of years.
The problem seems to me that why one can't simply adopt UK or whatever. There's a lot more political accountability in those countries. In other words, and that seems to be very important. Now, in my lifetime, I expect to live under only two governments, the past one and this one. There isn't as much political accountability. That's the fact of it. And so you don't have that pressure on the government to appoint the right person. You can appoint the board, but somebody's got to appoint the board. It'll be government at the end of the day. And as we heard from Mr. Mamania yesterday, you know, the structures, the legal structures, weren't strong enough to resist something.
Well,
you can never create that.
I accept that, and that's why I started off by saying that you have to work on the assumption that our constitutional structure works at least half well, if I can put it that way. I'm with you. That's my anxiety, that any particular proposal that one puts up has to work on an assumption, and that assumption is that people who are appointed behave with a level of public integrity, and when they do something wrong, they resign. You know, the problem that we've got in South Africa is very often people don't resign, they get promoted rather than resign. And you know, how you engender that culture, Judge Nugent, I agree, is a massive problem. What we're grappling with within that,
yes,
all of these are flaws. These are flaws. I'm working with the basis that with some level of publicity, some level of accountability, the hope that a tradition develops, that somebody who's a really, you know, serious chair of a board, taking their job very seriously, would create a tradition where that body would work really well. Now, there are instances in South Africa where that does work perfectly well.
The tension I'm finding in preparing this chapter for the chair here is there's a tension, and the big tension that arises. On the one hand, you don't want political interference in the tax functions of a commission. That's fundamentally important. So there you want some distance between a commissioner and a minister. But on functional, so the Minister of Finance is responsible for the financial performance of the country, the borrowings, the tax, the expenditure, and there you'd want him to be integrally involved in the taxing function. To me, that tension is one of the important issues that one grapples with in getting the right governance model. What would be your view on that?
Well, I agree, and that's why I started off by saying there's an inherent tension between a relatively autonomous body called the Revenue Authority on the one hand, and on the other hand, that it has a political set of implications, meaning it has to interface with the minister. Now, if you look at the OECD report, where they studied 43 countries, it appears that in all of the cases, the Minister of Finance or her equivalent has a general oversight view over the Revenue Service. In all of them. Right? And
do we have a copy?
Yeah, I'll give you this. I'll leave this with you, Professor.
Could you just explain what a general oversight role is?
Well, I
Does
think
he have authority over it.
Well, at least this they have to yes,
Report.
they have to report. They have to report to the minister, and in almost all of these cases, bearing in mind, of course, where of course it doesn't work here, is that in most of these cases, Australia and Canada, the Governor General in Council is the person who appoints the commissioner. So obviously they remove the commissioner. So when you report to the minister, if the minister really doesn't like what you're doing, go back to the Governor General in Council and get you removed. But there is a sense in which you are obliged to report to the minister. And I have no doubt about it that you have to have some official reportage to the minister. If you take what happened here, Judge Nugent, from my own experience, And, you know, I'm in the unique position of having had worked with a whole range of ministers since we got appointed. I don't need to tell you, I think we had something like about 5 ministers, you know, two of Minister Gordon, 2 of Mr. Nene, Mr. Gigaba, and Mr. Van Rooyen for a weekend. You know, so I worked with a lot of ministers, and these ministers had a real problem, and their problem was, how do they? When I would say
that weekend,
no, the weekend I didn't do anything. No, just to spare. But the rest of the time, when you spoke to a minister and you said, Minister, I'm hearing unofficially, the following. And when, for example, our job, if I could just say, would be where the minister would call us in and say, we're short of 30 billion, how are we going to get that? And we would probe these questions, including questions of the contribution of tax administration to that. And I would point out to the minister that we're not, you know, they're not doing enough on base erosion, profit shifting, they're not doing enough on corporate tax, etc., etc. The minister would almost shrug his shoulders and say, well, what do you want me to do? Because there was absolutely no basis by which the minister could then call the commissioner to account. We can't have that system. So the minister has to have some supervisory role over the commissioner. It may be that if you go either the board route or perhaps even the parliamentary route, then the question of removal is not the minister's function, which gives you a supervisory role without him being able to say, you know, I don't like you because, you know, you're a Liverpool supporter and therefore you've got to go, or some other irrationality. I think that's possible, but I do think that you have to have some ministerial supervision over a commissioner. It just doesn't work otherwise.
Could I move to another topic while we've got outside of governance, while we've got...
May I just ask one question? Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to understand, just going back to the board issue and the points you've raised in relation to providing oversight. I suspect that you're not suggesting that that board would have, in the exercise of its oversight, any power to second guess the determinations that either the commissioner or deputy commissioners would have made in relation to tax matters.
No. The board, Mr. Scotta, the board would, I think, have a much more helicopter view. You know, it would be, Judge Nugent asked me earlier, and I really did try to spend as much time as I could on this. It's a very difficult question, and I'm sorry to say, I don't have a proper answer for it. He asked me, well, what happens in circumstances where things are going wrong? Right, what do you do then? You know, short of, let's say, a firing, going through the removal. And I do think that a board would be able to give advice, whether to the commissioner or the minister, it's the case, or both, about broad issues, broad principles. We did have that tradition of the Tax Advisory Committee. I think it could be revamped in this way. And I remember spending, when I was a member of your commission, a lot of time with Jill Marcus, who was then the Deputy Minister of Finance, trying to reconfigure that body precisely for that end. But of course it would, and one of the problems that you can't have about a body like that is people sort of coming along and saying, you know, my client has got a problem, you know, how do we solve that? That's not what the body is about at all. It doesn't deal with individual tax matters. It deals with policy questions, and it may have to deal with performance questions. And think about this. If there was such a body, there's been a lot of debate about, you know, how much the SARS inefficiencies contributed to the deficits. And I have to say, I think it's a very complicated story, because having lived with this for years, but I want to illustrate why I think the board becomes important. I think that there was no doubt that the decline every year in the prediction of the GDP, which we've got the same problem again this year, a declining tax morality, which was not only caused by SARS, but by broader levels of corruption. I know this is very anecdotal, but we try to put in an amnesty provision. And the reason the amnesty didn't work as well as it should, for all sorts of reasons, but one of them unquestionably was the fact that people were saying, we are not going to become honest if all this money gets wasted. I mean, it's a pathetic justification, I accept that, but it was certainly part of the reason for the failure of the amnesty. So you've got that, you've got the decline in the growth rate, and it is true, you also have inefficiencies in SARS. Now, a board looking at these figures would be able to advise a minister, or at least have warning signs, because it could call for this evidence, it could deal with it independently, and you'd have some independent body actually looking at these particular questions before they actually create disastrous consequences. That's what I'm saying.
If I may, Advocate Steinberg, you're happy? Leave aside now these traditional questions of governance. Just one other area that I'd like to raise with you, and that's the relationship between, and I've been reading the Australian on this, the relationship between the Treasury and SARS in the following sense: tax policy, tax drafting, tax collection. In Australia, they split those three. What is your view? Has your committee looked at who's involved in tax policy, then drafting to give effect to the policy, and then collection?
It's a very good question. Yes, of course, because if you take tax policy, the problem with tax policy is that you've got people within Treasury who deal with a lot of tax policy, and rightly so. Obviously, they're critical to that. And there's often been tensions, and you know that too, because that came up even 2 decades ago, the tensions between Treasury policy and SARS policy. And I think you have to make a call. I think you're probably inevitably going to have policy questions dealt with on both sides. And I say that because Treasury obviously are in charge of the entire fiscal policy of the country, and for obvious reasons, therefore, they've got to know about these questions. SARS, on the other hand, do need to be capacitated from a research point of view and a policy point of view, because they see things where the rubber hits the road. And I think it's a different kind of policy, but it's not an unimportant part.
And drafting of tax
Well, drafting of tax has always been a problem. And it's always been a problem because I think tax legislation has been so poorly drafted. Anybody who's been a judge will know that they've struggled through all sorts of, sections of the Act, and my general standard view to students is that only an idiot or a genius could understand this, because no normal person could. And so the question is, I do think we need to capacitate that. Where that lies is probably something that you may want to think about, but I would have probably thought has to be in Treasury.
Judge, the next question I wanted to ask, if I may, the tax ombud.
Yeah.
Do you, in your experience and all, do you think that their functions, the demarcation of their functions is currently correct? Should anything change on that?
We recommended that the tax ombud's role should be strengthened quite considerably in our report, and we've
strengthened in scope or capacity?
Both, because think about it. If the tax ombud suddenly, got involved in the question of the VAT refunds, but I think that should have been something right up front. I mean, nobody, Professor Katz, and I'm sure you must have had a lot of experience with this with your own clients, was nobody who was in the tax world did not know that there was some serious problems going on with VAT refunds. And so the question is, well, why did it take so long? And I do think you want the tax ombud to be empowered to a greater extent, and to be able to deal with broader issues, and in a sense to have the power to do so. It's a body that has worked to some extent, there's no question, so why not actually try to make it better?
Well, just on that, let's take it in relation to tax refunds. Everyone knew, including in SARS. So why do you need a tax ombud to deal with that? You need the management to deal with that.
Well, I'm agreeing with you. That's why
for a thing like that, you don't need the strength.
Judge Nugent, that is exactly why I started off my presentation to you by saying the tragedy of all of this is everything that is coming out now was known.
Yeah.
You didn't have to read very widely. You open up any newspaper or the Daily Maverick or anything else, and you'd have known about this immediately. And the question was, everybody in SARS knew about it.
Yeah,
so I agree. part of
What
our recommendations is to engender, and that's why I spent so much time in the beginning trying to figure out how could we create a greater culture of independence, given what you've just said earlier, which is that we're not a society that has a long tradition of, let's say, public service of that kind. But I think that's to start with. All I'm saying is, if you want a belts and braces approach, you may, in an imperfect world like ours, want the tax ombudsman to have a greater role. That's all I'm saying.
Well, what greater role?
Well, that's what if I can just mention, we've got car guards at every block here. It seems that every public enterprise needs a car guard.
Yeah, yeah.
Someone who can move in with the powers, in fact, that this commission has, to investigate what is happening.
Yeah.
Now, whether that's the tax ombuds's job or not, I think the tax ombuds's job is really more of dealing with the public, but maybe you need someone.
Then you need what's called the Inspector of Taxation on the Australian route, which is essentially another body that actually looks over that. But then you could have a board of some sort doing that if you incapacitated that properly. You could have a situation where you gave a board the resources to be able to move in and say, we're receiving reports now. But I would want to be in a situation whereby a board would be able to have such stature that, let's say, a deputy commissioner or so many of the SARS people who spoke to me privately, and who I'm not going to mention because it would be totally unfair of me to do so, who told me things, all the stuff that has now come out, that came out in the public domain, and of course weren't able to do anything about it because they feared for their jobs and probably more. Then the question is, can you create a situation whereby you've got somebody where those people can go to, and they're proper whistleblowing protection, a whole range of, so you're right, it's not the ombud for that particular purpose. The ombud, I suspect, could be, what we were simply saying, I think, in our report, was that we wanted the taxpaying community to have greater rights because we recommended a Bill of Rights, Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, which has been on the cards ever since the Cats Commission, and that would be a broader form of scope for the tax ombud. But you're right to say that's a different issue. Yeah, but that's a different issue.
That's not really our issue.
No, I accept that. That was our issue. Yeah.
You did allude, the last question I wanted to raise, but you alluded to it, and you said it's very complex, is the causation of the under-recovery. How much a bad economy, how much administrative incapacity is. But what I do think that people have missed a point, the bad economy, to the extent it causes, the under-recoveries also cause a bad economy, because you impose a VAT because of under-recoveries. That then means that the retail sector, all of that's badly impacted, apart from the impact on the poor in that. So there is a greater relationship between underperforming tax administration causing an underperforming economy as well.
Look, I accept that, but I would caution against the simplistic argument that the VAT increase took place only because of the SARS problem. Now, it's perfectly obvious that I'm hardly the greatest advocate, for the performance of SARS up to present. So I'm not trying to be exculpatory here, but I am saying, Professor Katz, that if you've got an economy which is as tepid as ours, and you've got serious kind of expenditure pressure on the other hand, which one has to also look at if you're looking fiscally, it may be that we ran out of road in any event, and the 1% was always lurking there. It may well be that the last year of the under-recovery tipped the balance in favour of 1%, but I think it's a complex set of causal questions which gave rise to the 1% tax increase. One of the things I just want to say about that is, and it really vexes one, because when you're doing a budget, you see, if you say, well, we'll get, take for example the budget for next year. How are you going to be sure that you're going to actually kind of recoup some of that recovery, if I could put it that way? How would you do that if you want to get an accurate picture without having a deficit that is too large? In other words, if you say our expenditure is 100 and we can collect on our present model 85, but oh well, because SARS is going to be better, we'll get it up to 100. That's a very, very difficult call. And so you often have to do something like a tax increase when you're in trouble. And so that's why the causal issues are so much more complicated. I do think, there's no doubt in my mind, that given what no doubt you will produce and what will then be hopefully acted thereon, that we will probably have less pressure on the tax side going forward. There's no doubt. And let me just say this. I know a lot has been spoken about that Bain report. We saw that report. I was utterly horrified at the time. We weren't even able to get a copy of it. They wouldn't give us a copy. So they came along and they gave us this presentation, and everybody said, but this is insane. Right? And then we couldn't get a copy of it, so we could never comment on it properly.
Why couldn't you get a copy of it?
Because Mr. Moyani wouldn't give us one. You have to understand, Judge Nugent, in many instances, we couldn't get figures.
Well, I just wanted to ask you about, perhaps we can come back to that if you want to.
Judge,
Yeah, I'm sorry for waylaying you on that.
But
Yeah.
it's an important question
Yes.
I want to ask
Yeah.
you. Let me ask it now. If you
Oh,
don't
sorry,
mind.
Judge, I'm finished on governance. Dennis,
What was
very
your,
good.
has been very helpful.
what was your relationship?
And by the way, I'm happy to chat informally about these questions because of the amount of time that I've lived on this particular point. That if I can be of help, I'd be
It's been
delighted.
very
to.
helpful, Judge. Thanks a lot.
Pleasure. Sorry, Judge Nugent.
What can you describe your relationship as the Davis Tax Commission?
We're a committee. We were never given the subpoena powers that you have.
Can you give us a feeling for your relationship with the Commissioner?
Okay. I look, we were appointed before Mr. Moyani became the Commissioner of Inland Revenue. We were appointed by Praveen Gordhan, then Minister of Finance, and we were to basically, in a sense, it had been almost 20 years since the Cats Commission had reported, and we were supposed to do a similar job. By the way, the reason we weren't given subpoena powers was because actually nobody in their wildest dreams when we started thought that would be necessary in any way, so it was perfectly happy to be a committee. What then occurred was Mr. Moyani was appointed, and initially there was not really much of a problem between ourselves and Mr. Moyani, and we went happily along dealing with what we had to. But matters got, I think, more and more tense because clearly the relationship between the ministers of finance in general and Minister Gordhan in particular and Mr. Moyani started to fray, and we were actually a body giving advice to the minister. The Commissioner immediately, it seemed to me from once that started to see us as the enemy, that somehow we were telling the minister things, and we were desperately trying to say no. Our job, just like the previous commission, the Cats Commission, was there just to make the tax system better. But unfortunately, what then occurred was that our relationship started to deteriorate. Then what occurred was I had taken a policy decision that I would talk to any group that asked me to publicly about what our work was. So over the many years, I spoke to trade union groups and business groups and various forms of NGOs and goodness knows who else. And I was asked by this group of people, which seemed to be a think tank, and I think associated with I suppose, more left-wing political institutions, whether I'd come and give them a report on what we were doing, which I'd done hundreds of times. When I walked into the room, there I saw Mr. Ivan Pillay and some of these people who clearly were not on Mr. Moyani's Christmas card list. And I did what I had to do. I gave my talk, and the next thing, there was a report in the newspaper, not entirely accurate, but nonetheless, and I got a very rude letter from Mr. Moyani basically saying, how dare I've spoken to this group, and how could I make all these misrepresentations about SARS? There is a battery of correspondence that I'm prepared to make available because I replied meticulously saying, number one, before you wrote to me, I had seen this article. The journalist accepted that he'd been wrong and corrected it. Here is what I said, etc. But that was no good. From then on, the next thing, the various SARS spokespeople were sort of viciously attacking me and saying I had to be removed, and at some particular point in time even suggesting that I should be reported to the Judicial Service Commission. For what, I don't know. But what I'm saying is it became incredibly unpleasant, really unpleasant. What then happened, Judge, was that from that moment on, SARS people in the main, one or two, and I don't want to mention names because they may feel embarrassed, were really courageous and came to our meetings and helped us, right? But in the main, our information dried up. And if you look at the last amount of reports that we gave, we were working now without any collaboration in SARS, none. Right? We were advising the minister. I was having to advise the minister on where we should put up taxes or not, but without any cooperation from SARS at all. And in fact, I've just spoken to Minister Nene because it seems to me that some of our work has not been finished. And now under a new regime, we can complete that work because we can get the figures and the material that is required from SARS for us to actually get
What regime has changed?
Well, Mr. Kingan is a lot more collaborative than...
Well, I mean, Mr. Kingan...
He's a very nice man. I mean,
I mean, Mr. Kingan might be out of a job soon.
well, he might be, but all I'm saying is,
Anyway,
I'm
let's
sorry.
not
All
talk about that.
I'm saying is that there is a. Once Mr. Mayani was suspended, right? It is perfectly obvious to me that people were more than happy to chat on a much more open fashion. That's what I'm saying. What I am saying is our relationship was just deteriorated markedly from that moment on. There was no justification for it. Every time I got a letter, and they were lengthy letters, I responded. I asked for meetings. I asked to see Mr. Mayani in order that I could explain to him that I had nothing, that whatever he did was not of interest to me. All that was of interest to me was to provide the minister with the best possible fiscal advice that I could. And I'm afraid to say they were always left unanswered.
Can I just, when you mentioned your response to the Bain report now, Bain are here at the moment.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's fair to them to just say what your problems were with it. So
My
if
problems
they,
with Bain
if they
were...
want to, they can respond to what.
I'll tell you what the problems with Bain was. That I never quite understood what the entire need for this restructuring was. That actually SARS actually had a pretty good mechanism. That the large business centre and that the various other components of SARS were really very, very good organisationally. All you needed to do was tinker there a little bit and we were home. Right? I mean, what happened as a result of that was that you looked at this widespread kind of reconfiguration of SARS and asked, why do you need to fix something that's not broke? And that report made no sense to me. It certainly didn't seem to me to be best international practice, and it certainly didn't seem to me to be best practice given where SARS was. And there were disastrous consequences. So let me give you two. Clearly, because, and you know them, because of the large business centre collapsing, all sorts of problems occurred on the corporate side. But more important than that, the base erosion and profit shifting stuff, right, nothing happened. I kept on being promised, when Mr. Mayani and I had our last meeting, and I can't remember where it was, but here it was shortly before Mr. Makwakwa got suspended. I do remember that. And I raised with him, and that's why I wanted to raise with you, I raised with him what it was, and it's part of this is in the report that we were interested in 2 or 3 very significant areas which we thought would assist greatly. One was the question of base erosion and profit shifting in the light of greater international cooperation, given the various OECD initiatives and better access to information from other tax authorities. The second was following the Mbeki report on corrupt income flows. What were we doing about that? And in particular, what were we doing about customs hemorrhaging as a result of the disturbing reports that were coming our way with regard to cigarette smuggling and a whole range of other issues. Thirdly, what were we doing with high net individuals? Bain had raised issues in that regard, but it didn't seem to me that we had to go that route, that there were ways of dealing with that. That was the third component that we were particularly interested in. And we said, if you look at those 3, what energy are we putting into these issues? What are we doing? Right? And frankly, nothing happened. And I don't think, when I looked at the Bain report, that I would have used it in any way, and we didn't. I mean, we certainly were given the report presented to us over 3-4 hours, but you'll notice that we make, the recommendations we make are completely diametrically opposed to what they had. We believe ours were on best practice. They were developed as a result of very lengthy conversations I've had with international tax authorities the world over the last 3-4 years, and it seemed to me, quite frankly, there was no need for that particular report. And I might add, we did it all for about very little money.
Well, that's the judge's salary.
No, I didn't get paid. Yes, you're quite right. And I didn't mean that. Others were paid. But what I'm saying is, it was a no-brainer to us, Judge Nugent, and I think that when that report was put to us, I realised we were in trouble.
Can I just say that we've heard from Bain the following. They said, look, there's nothing wrong with the structure. It depends upon how it's used.
Yes.
In other words, what people you put in, what management you've got, etc. So that's a managerial problem that created all the problems,
Yeah.
rather than the structure.
Yeah.
Do you have a response to
Well,
that?
let me put this way. I'm not in any position, neither do I want to suggest any level of bad faith or anything on the part of Bain. I mean, if they got it wrong because people do get things wrong. I think that the structure that they put in seemed to me to be, one, inappropriate, and two, not necessary. One of the great triumphs, and I'm not saying this because Professor Katz is sitting next to you, but it's a fact, of the Katz Commission's report was the way in which it recommended a semi-autonomous SARS unit, and SARS over 20, or let's say over 15 years thereafter, structured itself to be extraordinarily efficient. And you only have to look at tax buoyancy rates to realize that why would you want to change a structure when the tax buoyancy rates consistently were over 1? It didn't make any sense to me. It still makes no sense to me.
But I'm still not getting you around what about the structure was inappropriate, because I think there's one thing around how people operate within the structure,
Yeah.
as opposed to that the structure is itself inherently flawed. And so I want to understand.
Well,
in
it
what
seems to me that
respect is it
once you
inherently
start
flawed?
fiddling around with things like the large business centre, etc., you're really asking for trouble. Just to give you a starter, right? But what I'm saying is, I mean, let me be honest. It's a long time since I've gone through that Bain report. If you gave me a half an hour, I'd probably be able to give you 25 things that was wrong with it. But what I'm saying is, I remember. What I'm doing is I'm recollecting my reaction at the time and the conversation that we had as a commission, as a committee, after we were presented with the report, and why we didn't think that report was particularly appropriate. I should tell you that I spoke to when Pravin Gordhan returned as the Minister of Finance, we discussed this. And of course he was totally on sides, and I might add, nobody in this country knows more about SARS than Pravin Gordhan. I mean, he was a fantastically successful commissioner. So I was talking to somebody that, I didn't need to push the door, it was open. And his view about it and my view were exactly the same. When I went to see him, I said, this is the problem. He said, I agree with you. It's exactly why I'm now going to tell Mr. Moyane to stop the process.
You mentioned the large business centre, which is one thing, but you've just touched on another which seemed to be quite central to their thinking, and that is, they said there was too much power in the hands of the chief operating
Mr.
officer,
Hall.
Mr. Hall.
Yeah.
And you earlier said, well, perhaps there was, but you could deal with it a different way.
Yeah, I think
Well, you
Mr.
need
Hall
to
was,
ask
by
him.
the way, a very efficient fellow. I mean, from all reports that I received, I think the answer to that would have been a quite simple question of probably taking some of his portfolio away and giving it to somebody else. But the problem was at the time that if you were going to have a commissioner, well, let me go back. One could say, if I preempt perhaps some criticism that could be levelled at what I'm about to say, which if you've got a commissioner who knows nothing about the business, right, which is what, in fairness, I think is common cause when Mr. Moyane came from correctional services to SARS, You could have the same accusation could be made about Mr. Gordon. But those who know Mr. Gordon, of which I was one, will know that he spent 6 months to a year, and I'm sure Professor Katz had his ear bent many, many times, just like I did, where Mr. Gordon spent a very long time asking people who he thought were the tax experts in this country what he should do about X, Y, Z, and he tested the one against the other. So when he arrived, when the rubber hit the road with him, he was well appraised. The problem here, Judge, was that to some extent you had a Mr. Hall who really did know what he was doing, and Mr. Mayani who had no experience of tax, and then to get rid of Mr. Hall and then have some, structure without thinking. Now, of course, they'll say that's the personality issues. My argument was actually with a far less radical maneuver, with one or two perhaps proper appointments, everything else would have been able to be perfectly fine. And you certainly didn't need a massive report of the kind that we were subjected to tell me that.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
David.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Judge David.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Judge.
Pleasure.
Judge, our next witness is the procurement officer from Treasury. I think Mr. Mamoni has gone to find